I'm going to just get started because I'm cognizant of the time. But I'm Natasha Cheong. I'm a grad student here at U of T in the urban planning program. And I'm here to talk to you today about, it's that one right there, building affordable housing on public land. Thank you so much. Awesome. So the relationship between public land and affordable housing, it's relatively a new field within academia. I'm still learning, so it's constantly evolving. So I structured the talk today just really looking at Toronto strategies, and then I'm going to start talking about Vancouver strategies and look at some lessons we can learn from Vancouver, and then finish off with some recommendations. So looking at the City of Toronto strategies, utilizing public land for affordable housing has always been historically an option in Toronto. We've seen the Housing First policy, which was implemented back in the late 90s, and this was a policy that actually prioritized building affordable housing on public land when departments deemed their land surplus. Unfortunately, it didn't yield that many affordable housing units. It was revised in 2009 when Build Toronto was created. And as Sean mentioned, Build Toronto, it is a independent kind of arm's length real estate development corporation run through the City of Toronto. And so the Housing First policy, again, we had 48 city surplus sites, but just under 3,000 units were actually affordable. And then when Build Toronto was implemented, we did see an increase in residential development. However, again, the affordable housing units, 284, it's not substantial. So again, the City of Toronto were not hitting their targets within the hot action plan. Housing Now initiative is also a City of Toronto strategy, which Sean talked about, so I'm going to skip over that. And then the other strategy that I looked into was the Toronto Community Housing Revitalization Programs. And so within those projects, what we're seeing is that the City of Toronto is actually selling off portions of their land in order to finance these kind of projects. And so within my research, what I did, I really looked at it through kind of the theoretical underpinnings of Susan Feinstein's The Just City and David Harvey's The Right to the City. And I looked at whether or not these public land strategies were actually being, or whether or not they were looking at public land as a public good. So were they serving some kind of wider social benefit? So when we look at land control, I'm asking, are we keeping the public land in the control of the public, or is the public keeping the control, or are we actually selling it to the private market? In terms of tenure, we do know that rental households are disproportionately impacted by the housing crisis. So the question was, do these strategies actually favor rental households? In terms of depth of affordability, I'm asking, who are these strategies actually serving? Is it a middle income policy? Is it a low income policy? And then within Toronto, we do see, as Sean mentioned, the Housing Now initiative is 80% of market, and the Open Door program is usually 80% of average market rate as well. So again, this kind of is more of a middle income policy as opposed to serving lower income households. And then finally, looking at length of affordability. The Housing Now initiative is a strategy that is affordable in perpetuity. However, historically, again, like through Create TO and the Toronto Community Housing Revitalization projects, they were utilizing open door programs, so the affordable housing was only affordable for 25 years. So I was really curious, again, in my research, in particular, looking at other cities. So despite the scenic views, Vancouver and Toronto do have some similarities in terms of their housing crisis. We do know, both of these cities are experiencing severe housing core need. Their vacancy rates are hovering just above and below 1%. They're both experiencing socioeconomic segregation in the sense that the lower income households are really being pushed out to the margins. And these two cities are also seeing an increase in homelessness. And so despite these similarities experienced by both of the cities, Vancouver and Toronto have actually diverged in the way that they're utilizing their public land for affordable housing. And so I'm just going to give you a quick overview of the two strategies that Vancouver is using. So the first is the Community Land Trust Partnership. And the Community Land Trust Foundation is actually a nonprofit established by the Cooperative Housing Federation of BC. And so they're the real estate arm. And they're currently working together with the city and the City of Vancouver's affordable housing agency, VAHA, to develop 12 sites which will deliver around 1,500 affordable housing units. And so CLT Foundation is actually the largest community land trust delivering affordable housing in Western Canada and is the most active community housing developer in the country. And so for those of you who don't know, the Community Land Trust housing model, what they actually do is they take the land and the housing units out of the market and hold it in a trust. And so the housing is actually affordable in perpetuity. And so in this case, with Vancouver, the city actually remains the landowner and leases it to the CLT Foundation, who are then responsible for developing the units and tenanting the housing. So another strategy that the City of Vancouver has engaged in is building temporary modular housing units on city-owned land. And so modular housing is unique in the sense that it is a prefabricated construction model. And so the units are constructed off-site, and then they're brought back onto the site and reassembled. And so in an effort to end homelessness, British Columbia's housing corporation, BC Housing, they committed $66 million to develop 600 new supportive, and we're talking about shelter rate 375 social housing units. And so in this case, the city still remains the landowner of the public land, but BC Housing actually owns the modular units. And so bringing it back to just kind of the comparative analysis that I did, we can see in Vancouver Strategies, within the land control, it remains in the public. For tenure, they're focusing specifically on rental households. The depth of affordability, they have a wide range of actually supporting folks on income assistance, and also to the lower end of the market, which is 90% of whatever the AMR is, or the average market rate is in Vancouver. And then finally, length of affordability. The CLT is 99 years, so in perpetuity. The temporary modular units are unfortunately only 5 years, which I will critique. However, the city is in negotiations for potentially extending the 5 years. And then I quickly just want to bring up, the key kind of differences. So within Toronto, especially within the Housing Now initiative, there's no guarantee that there will be some form of nonprofit partnership. Housing Now does have a nonprofit capacity building fund of $1 million. However, after talking to a couple nonprofit housing developers and nonprofit housing operators, they're very curious to see how this actually pans out, so we don't know yet. In contrast, Vancouver, they've committed to actually having CLT as their nonprofit housing developer. In addition, all the sites will be operated by nonprofit housing operators. And then finally, as I mentioned before, the depth of affordability. Sean did mention for the Housing Now initiative, for the deeper affordable units, this is 40% of average market rate. However, it is only 3.6% of the total units, so it's around 360 out of the 10,000 units that the City of Toronto has committed to build on public land. And if we actually look at the shelter rates, so of incomes who are on social assistance in Ontario, they receive $390 a month. And if 40% of AMR is $435 for a bachelor, these individuals actually still cannot afford to live in these units. However, if you're in receipt of ODSP, Ontario Disability, you might be able to access these units. However, again, there's no mention whether or not there will be supportive services. And with Vancouver, we have 103 shelter units. And this is actually within the CLT, and within the temporary modular, there's 600. So quickly, again, just some lessons learned. We do see BC Housing actually committing to financing a lot of the supportive and social housing units in Vancouver, unlike we have in Toronto. And I think it was Mike Layton announced, we're not building supportive housing. So we do need to really advocate for more provincial funding for that. Second, looking at policy design, the portfolio approach was very important for the CLT success. So instead of actually individually tendering all of the public sites in Vancouver, they bundled the sites together. And so by choosing CLT as the sole developer, they were actually able to engage in kind of an economies of scale, and they were able to cross-subsidize and leverage the higher valued units to subsidize the lower income, deeper affordable units. And then finally, we have the importance of partnerships and financial institutions. So there were a lot of social actors involved in the CLT projects. However, Vancity, which is Canada's largest credit union, along with New Market Funds, which is an impact investment firm, they were really key social actors towards financing and operating and catalyzing these projects. And then I'll just end it with some recommendations, and I think Sean also has some recommendations, so we can chat about that after. But first and foremost, the City of Toronto, we really need to kind of invest in building a richer social purpose real estate financing ecosystem, especially as I mentioned, the success of CLT really hinged upon Vancity and New Market Funds. Second, the City of Toronto needs to serve more as a platform for fostering social public partnerships with nonprofits and cooperative housing organizations. And then finally, governments tend to be a little more risk adverse, and so if they are shying away from the portfolio approach due to reasons that hopefully we'll get into in the discussion, we could potentially try a portfolio approach pilot project to see if it works. So, and that's that.